Hi, everyone. My name is Allison Antman, and I'm an occupational therapist here at Chicago Pediatric Therapy and Wellness Center. Thanks for joining us all as you're, at home, tuning in for this installment of Parent University, where we talk about how to support sensory regulation at home. So before we dive in, I'm just going to kind of lay out what we'll talk about during this recording. We'll start by talking about what is sensory regulation and reviewing the sensory systems. Then we'll talk about some recommended strategies to use to support sensory regulation at home. I'll then share some resources for extra learning about sensory regulation. And then I'll have time at the end for folks to leave questions or comments in a comment on the video posted online, or offer an opportunity for you all to email your therapist if you have any other questions or concerns. So we'll just go ahead and get started. First, we're going to talk about what is OT and how it relates to sensory regulation. So occupational therapy is a healthcare profession that works with people of all ages to promote their participation in and performance of meaningful activities called occupations. So you can think of an occupation as anything that occupies your time. So in this presentation, we're going to talk about sensory regulation from the perspective of an occupational therapist, meaning that we're going to talk about how our sensory regulation, sensory integration, and sensory processing can impact our participation in or performance of different occupations. So before we really dive in, we're just going to go over a few quick terms that I think would be helpful for everyone to know before we keep learning together. So to start off, like I said, an occupation is any meaningful activity that occupies your time. So an occupation for many of your kiddos are things like sleep, eating, playing, going to school, getting dressed, using the bathroom. Again, any meaningful activity that occupies their time. Then we have a term called sensory seeking. This is a term that some of you might be familiar with, and it describes any child or really any person who is just always in search of more sensory input. So you can think of the person who's super active, maybe a little wiggly in their chair, someone who might get distracted easily, someone who loves loud noises and running around or watching blinking flashing lights. And on the other end, we have a term that goes by sensory avoiding. And this term really describes anyone who gets overwhelmed quite easily by sensory input. So folks who are sensory avoiders might not like touching or things touching their body. They might not like bright lights or loud noises. They may prefer to play alone, and they might not like to try a bunch of running or jumping or other sorts of like gym equipment in a big gross motor space. So now that we know some important terms that might come up throughout this presentation, I'd also like to share a little bit about what is sensory integration and processing before we really dive in to understand what sensory regulation is. So sensory integration is the ability of the brain to change due to continued experiences of sensory information. So sensory integration organizes sensations from a person's body and their environment and allows that person to use their body successfully in their environment. So you could think of sensory integration as like the pathway in. We're taking in all of our senses from the outside world, then we're processing them in our brain, which leads us to sensory processing, which is the ability to act appropriately based on the sensory information that we take in. So again, sensory integration, we take in information from the outside world, we organize it in our brain. Sensory processing, we act as an output and behave in a particular way in response to the sensory information that we took in. So sensory integration, think input, sensory processing, think more of that output. We're also going to talk briefly about the sensory systems. There are 8. So the first we'll talk about is visual, which is how we use our eyes to understand color, motion, shape, and the objects in our environment. The next is our auditory sense, which is how we hear and understand sounds. The next is our olfactory sense, which is how we detect smell or different odors. The next is our gustatory sense, which is how we detect taste. The next is our vestibular sense, which is how we manage our sense of balance and where our body is in space. And it's this one's super cool. It's actually connected to the canals in your inner ear with different amounts of fluid in your ears. And when the fluids shift, it might offset our sense of balance or confuse where our body is in space. The next one is our proprioceptive system. And this system focuses on body awareness and helps our body detect pressure and force coming from our joints and our muscles. The next one is our tactile system, which is our sense of touch. So how our body takes in and understands information through our sense of touch. And the last one is interoception, which is maybe one that has become trendier more lately, like in the news and in the literature. And interoception is how we use information from our inner organs, so like from inside our body, to tell our body what we need. So interoception helps support like our hunger cues is interoception. Understanding when someone needs to go to the bathroom is based on interoception. So again, finding those messages from inside our body. Think of like your gut feeling. So now that we have all that background information, we can talk about what is sensory regulation and then what is sensory dysregulation. Sensory regulation is the process of our body taking and adjusting sensory stimuli to achieve a state where someone is calm, focused, and ready to participate in a variety of activities. So you might have heard folks say like, oh, this kiddo is very regulated. That person might be describing that this kiddo is ready to learn and is sitting at the table and is focused on whatever activity is being presented to them. Whereas on the other hand, sensory dysregulation is a mind or a body state that occurs when the body is out of balance because of something that's happening in the sensory environment. So this might look like a child who's like running all over the classroom, or a child who is screaming and covering their ears when an ambulance drives by because of the loud noise. Really any sort of sensory experience that makes the child kind of upset because of that sensory experience that they're having. So it's really important to understand the difference between sensory and emotional dysregulation in order to truly understand what someone's sensory needs are, because the two could kind of be confused sometimes. It's sometimes a little hard to tell what is sensory regulation and what is emotional regulation or dysregulation. And it's important to tease out both of those in order to provide a child with helpful solutions for moments of sensory dysregulation. So sensory dysregulation are when experiences at the root of the behavior pattern or the problem are sensory in nature, not just emotional or social experiences. So just because something is related to the sensory experience doesn't mean that sensory dysregulation is occurring. But if there's more of a reaction to what may be typical or expected for your child, they might be experiencing sensory dysregulation. So like, for example, we have Alex who may cover his ears when he hears the fire trucks coming down the street, kind of like how I just mentioned, and that's pretty typical. But we also have Noah in that same classroom who may cover her ears and run to the back of the class and hide underneath like a giant pillow or a crash pad. And this is atypical. This sort of grand reaction to the loud noise is not usually what we'd see in kiddos. So that is an indicator that Noah's experiencing sensory dysregulation. So we have a brief knowledge check here just to help us understand the difference between sensory and emotional dysregulation. So I'll go ahead and read some of these, and then I'll pause for a moment, and then we'll talk about the answer. So our first scenario says, after transitioning back to his classroom from lunch and recess, where he was playing The Floor is Lava with his peers, Timmy is having trouble sitting still and participating in circle time. Is this sensory or emotional dysregulation? Take a moment to think about your answer. So if you said that this is sensory dysregulation, you would be correct. What we know from this story is that Timmy was just running around, having so much fun, moving his body super, super fast with his friends at lunch and recess. And now he's having a harder time kind of slowing down and zoning in for circle time. So the fact that he was running around, moving his body super fast before circle time, and now he's having a really hard time kind of sitting down and focusing during that moment lets us know that this is sensory in nature. Whereas the second scenario, we have Grace. And in this scenario, Grace's classmate unexpectedly takes a toy from her that she's playing with, which makes her very upset. We're wondering, is this sensory or emotional dysregulation? And if you said this is emotional dysregulation, you would be correct. In this story, we know that Grace was playing with one of her favorite toys, and someone from her class came up and stole it very quickly from her hands, which was really confusing and made her very upset. And since that instance isn't rooted in sensory problems or sensory experience, the complicated feelings she's having are rooted in the peer stealing the toy from her. We know that that's more emotional dysregulation versus sensory dysregulation. So how can you tell if your child is dysregulated? There are different signs that we could look out for to help understand when a child is regulated and feeling good versus dysregulated and needing some support to get back to a calm, focused state. So here are a couple different things you can look for. Generally, if a child is anxious, stressed, or on edge, if a child is irritable, snappy, or disagreeable, if a child is highly sensitive to external stimuli, or if a child is having trouble with attention or concentration, those might be cues that a child is dysregulated. So some signs to look out for are if a child is like overly sensitive to lights or sounds, if a child is getting distracted by a lot of noise, if a child hits or pushes themselves or other people, if a child has a strong desire for routine or sameness and isn't showing us a lot of flexibility, and if a child is unable to sit still. This is not an all-encompassing list by any means, but these are just some common things that you might see in your kiddos at home or across different settings even, that are good indicators to tell us if, this child needs a little bit more support to help their body feel good. So OT plays a really big role in sensory integration and processing and supporting the sensory needs of individuals across the lifespan. So we do this by assessing different sensations in people, exposing different sensory stimulations, and collaborating and problem solving to identify strategies to allow individuals to co-regulate or regulate themselves so that they can more meaningfully participate in their daily activities. With that, it's incredibly important for OTs and families to work together. Collaboration is at the heart of the relationship between OTs and families. And here are some different ways that OTs and families can work together to meet the sensory needs of the OT's client and the child of the family. So OTs and families can discuss sensory-related observations. They can identify helpful sensory strategies to support regulation. They can problem solve how best to implement strategies at home in a feasible way that makes sense and is practical for the family. And they can establish and implement sensory diets if appropriate, which we'll talk about at the very end. So there are a couple different best practices or rules that one should follow when talking about these sensory needs and supporting the sensory needs of children across all settings. It's super important to remember that every child is different. So what works for one child might not work for another. And with that being said, strategies should be used. The strategies that are used should be specific to the sensory needs of that child. So it's really important to follow the lead of the child and ask questions like, what makes this child feel comfortable and calm and focused? And on the other hand, what makes this child feel upset, anxious, antsy, or distracted? In order to understand what would be helpful, what strategies would help make this child, feel better in challenging moments to get us back to that regulated state. It's also really important to respect the child's sensory needs. Everyone has different sensory needs. Some folks love blasting loud music at the very highest volume, and other folks would much prefer it almost close to off. And that's okay. We're all different. We're allowed to have different sensory needs and different tolerances. With sensory regulation, sensory integration and processing, it's really important to understand the threshold of the child that you're working with, in order to find kind of that just right balance between, providing enough of what the child needs, but not too much so that it's like overwhelming or dysregulating in any way. It's also incredibly important to stay in frequent communication with a therapeutic or a school team, so that everyone is on the same page and can be utilizing these super helpful strategies across all settings. So, what are some sensory activities that can support my child's sensory needs? We're going to go through, and talk about, all the sensory categories again, both, some alerting activities to like wake our bodies up and some calming activities to help calm us down, for each of the different sensory categories, and provide different strategies that can be used at home. So first we'll talk about visually focused activities, some alerting visually focused activities. So activities that will wake us up and give us energy are playing with light up toys, maybe playing with a light bright, playing with kaleidoscopes or playing with pinwheels. And some calming visually focused activities are maybe doing like a paint by number, watching lava lamps or sand timers or one of those oil lamps or those glitter sensory bottles, or some other type of like slow, rhythmically moving object. And then the third option could be like playing I Spy, if a child likes to engage in some, interactive play. Some alerting auditory focused activities are listening to loud, fast-paced, upbeat music, hearing some loud appliances, maybe around the home, like a vacuum, a hair or hand dryer, a microwave or a blender, playing with some musical instruments or musical toys, playing with really any toy that has any sort of auditory component, or playing freestands. Get the body moving a little bit. And then some calming activities are listening to some very calm, slow music, or listening to nature sounds like rain or waves crashing or the rustling leaves. Some alerting tactile, vestibular, and proprioceptive activities, are light tickling movements on the skin. So imagine like using your fingernails and just kind of like brushing them over, maybe your child's arms or back or legs, to wake us up a little bit. Engaging in fast circular spinning on a swing. So think about like going round and round and round, sliding down a slide, rocking or bouncing or jumping on a medicine ball, jumping on a trampoline, and running. And then some calming activities are slow linear swinging. So think about like your average swing at a playground or something, just going back and back and forth on that in a really relaxing way. Feeling some slow, deep rubs on a child's back or arm or legs. Feeling some slow, deep squeezes on a child's back or arm or legs. So deep squeezes kind of look like where you're just, holding holding that part of the child's body and just not squeezing too tight at all, but just enough to give, like a comfortable soft squeeze, in a really soft, relaxing way. Can be really calming and regulating. Different types of crawling, or like animal walks. So think like bear crawls, army crawls, slithering like a snake on the ground where the child like uses their arms to, kind of crawl their body forward. Can be really regulating and really calming. Climbing up and down the stairs. This is especially a good one because it's super rhythmic. There's a start and a stop and it's pretty repetitive. So it's a pretty, easy sequence to follow. Using a body sock, there's an image of that in the upper right corner of your screen. It's essentially like this huge stretchy sheet that your body goes in, and it's kind of fun to like move around in there, and it feels really nice on your body. Playing with putty or Play-Doh, and jumping, crashing, and then getting a nice deep squeeze or some deep pressure into a blanket or a pillow are all really calming activities. Some alerting taste and smell focused activities are eating spicy, sour, sweet, or crunchy foods and smelling some really strong smells. And some calming activities are smelling some essential oils. So think of those like lavender oils or mint, or potentially like maybe lemongrass is one, or let's see. I feel like all like an almondy extract could be really calming. Eating some sticky or gummy food, and then drinking something really thick with like a high viscosity. So like a really thick smoothie, maybe a milkshake, or eating like a very thick spread. So like peanut butter, hummus, or Nutella. It really requires us to like use our mouth in a really use those muscles in your mouth in like a very like controlled, slow way. So what does this actually look like in action? We're going to go through a couple different case studies, which are little just like, again, short stories to talk about, different hypothetical situations that you might see at home, and offer some ideas for some strategies to use that could be helpful. So, number one says your child is moving really fast and repeatedly crashing into furniture and other items around the home. They're also dumping out buckets of toys. Should you look for calming or alerting sensory activities? And what are some sensory activities that you could try to support their needs? So you can go ahead and pause this video, take a moment to kind of think about what your answer would be, and then just like before, we'll go through and talk about some different ideas. So if you said calming activities would be the best idea, then you'd be correct. And some different activities that you could support your child in participating in are organizing an obstacle course where there's any sort of like climbing, crawling, or walking up and down the stairs, wearing their body sock while listening to maybe their favorite calming music or watching an oil timer, swinging back and forth if you have a swing or if you live near a playground, and drinking a really thick smoothie or eating some frozen fruit as a snack, if they might be a little hungry. Our next hypothetical situation says your child appears to have low energy and is having a hard time listening and following instructions. They aren't responding to their name in the way that they normally do. Should you look for calming or alerting sensory activities? And what are some sensory activities that you can try to best support their needs? So again, take a moment to pause, think about your answer, and then we'll go through it. So if you said an alerting sensory activity would be helpful, you would be correct. We definitely need to wake our body up a little bit. So some different ways that you could do that are bouncing on like a yoga ball, listening to some upbeat music, engaging in some fast spinning on a swing or one of those little spinner toys if you have one of those at home or live near the park, and playing with any sort of like pinwheel or fast changing light up toy or like movement toy. If you have any specific questions about your child's sensory needs or sensory activities to try at home, definitely reach out to their occupational therapist. They would be more than happy to talk about different ideas with you. So now we're almost at the end. We're going to briefly talk about what a sensory diet is, just because I imagine so many of you have probably heard of this term. And we'll talk about how it can actually be used in practice, how it can be used at home. So a sensory diet is a set of activities that are used as sensory strategies to help a child modulate their arousal, which means like control how hyper or calm they are to support regulation, attention, and general well-being. So a sensory diet is, again, specific to the sensory needs of the child, and the sensory diet can help calm our body down or alert and wake our body up to gain more energy to match the task at hand. Sensory diets are helpful for kids who have pretty significant sensory needs and who rely on these sensory strategies to support their regulation. And you can participate in sensory diet activities proactively throughout the day to maintain regulation, but you can also participate in the activities during moments of dysregulation in order to help our body come back to feeling good. So how does my child get a sensory diet? If appropriate, your child will be prescribed a sensory diet, probably by their occupational therapist. Sensory diets should not be prescribed by anyone else, as OTs really have the most knowledge to support creating that diet and understanding how to put it in practice. The last question says, my child has been prescribed a sensory diet by their OT. What does that mean for me at home? So participating in a sensory diet or sensory diet activities at home is actually really helpful for supporting their regulation across different settings. So collaborate with the occupational therapist to discuss when, like at what times during the day, and what activities your child should be participating in order to support their regulation at home. Here are a couple sensory resources, which just provide some extra information, easily digestible, flyers and little snippets in case anyone is interested in learning more about sensory regulation and how you can support that in the home. Now would be a great opportunity to leave a comment down below if you have any questions or would like to share a comment or a concern. Or take this opportunity to reach out and email your therapist if this conversation stirred any thoughts in your head and you'd like to get some help with that. So thank you all for listening. I hope this was helpful in understanding what is sensory regulation, what is sensory integration and processing, and how you can support your child's sensory regulation at home. Please reach out with any further questions. Thanks, guys.